In the last section of the course, we'll actually take a look at storing data in a SQL Server. In this section, we are going to take a look at creating a database and configuring the NT Framework core library. Then we'll just implement our SQL repositories using NT Framework and Link. And finally, we'll test our application, make the final adjustments, and discuss the overall solution of our application. In this video, we'll create a database and configure the NT Framework. At first, we'll start with creating our SQL Server database, and then we'll move on to configuring the NT Framework core library. Alright, at first, you need to install and run your SQL Server instance. You can also run it somewhere in the cloud, or run it also on your Linux or macOS like I do. I'm running it through the Docker, so I will get into these details as it's not part of the scope, but as you can see, my SQL Server is running here on my local host. So once you get your SQL Server up and running, you need to install some tools to actually make a connection to your SQL Server and be able to create a database. So what you can do is, for example, install SQL Server Management Studio, which is for free, or you can also use some other tools like DataGrip from JetBrains, or TeamSQL, or SQL Toolbase from Redgate, and so on. So once you have it installed, let's actually try to connect to our database. And I will show you the way how you can do it through the Visual Studio Code. So at first, you need to install a plugin, which is called MS SQL. And when you install the plugin, you can actually create a connection profile. So here I'll just click Command Shift and P on my macOS, or Control Shift P on your Linux or Windows. And then I'll just create a new connection profile. Select this Manage Connection Profiles, and I could just create. And let's take a look at what password do I have. I have this password ABCD1234 and exclamation mark. So let's do it once again. Create a new connection profile. Let's say this one will skip. So we'll just type here localhost, as we are connected to local database. Database name will be default. Then the system account, so SA, and our password, so ABCD1234 exclamation mark. And yeah, I want to save our password, and I just name our profile. I'll just call it Spets. And now we can connect to our database. So the first thing that you want to do is to actually create a new file and just change it to be of type SQL. So just type SQL to be able to actually connect to the database. So right now I could connect to my database. I have prepared here within the scripts directory a script to actually create a database for our application. So I just click Ctrl Shift and P, or Command Shift and P if you're using Mac like I do. Then select Connect, select the profile, and you will see here that I'm connecting to my database. And now I'm connected and I can execute some queries. So at first, let's execute this one. So you can right click and just click this execute query, or you could just click Command Shift and E or Control Shift and E, and let's run it. Here you can see our results. So it says that the query executed successfully. So let's change our context to be of this Cubo database. Once again, execute the query. And right now we are within this Cubo newly created database. So let's create these two tables. Let's execute the query here, and we'll have tables. And as you can see, we have our buckets table with ID, and same for the items with bucket ID, and so on. And we can try to do select, and yeah, we get nothing, which is of course correct. Now let's get back into our C# code. So here, let's install two packages. At first, let's install into our core, let's install the NT Framework. So we'll just type .NET add package, and it's Microsoft.NTT Framework core.SQL Server as the provider for the SQL Server. And one more thing that we'll use in the next video, which is called in-memory database. So Microsoft NT Framework Core in-memory provider, like this. And right now, let's actually run our .NET Restore. Okay, so before we go further, let's get back into our domain model. Let's go into our item. And here, we would like to have an ID of the bucket. So we just want to have this relation somehow maintained. So we just create a new ID, GUID bucket ID here. Let's make it also a protected setter, like this. And within our constructor, we like to actually provide our bucket ID, like this. And we can just set our bucket ID to the bucket ID. All right. And now we need to fix our code. So here within add item, we just want to provide our bucket ID. All right, now let's actually make use of the entity framework. So within our core directory, let's create a new folder and let's call it EF, so which stands for the entity framework. And let's create a new so-called DB context. So we'll just name this one a Cubo context, and it will derive from a base class called DB context. All right, we're adding the using to entity framework core here. And now let's do a few things. Before we go further with our Cubo context, let's actually create a settings for our entity framework core. So here in the same folder, let's just call it a new SQL settings. And we want to have here at least for now one property. So it will just be our connection string like this, okay? And let's get back into our Cubo context. Within our Cubo context constructor, we want to actually inject two things. The first one is called DB context options of our Cubo context. And this one actually is required if you want to be able to actually configure our database provider within our context. So just call it maybe options. And then another one, our newly created settings. So we'll just inject here our iOptions interface of SQL settings type. So we'll just call it SQL settings like this, add a using here. And let's assign it to a private variable or a private field in that case. So private SQL settings like this. And here we just want to actually make use of a base constructor and provide our options. All right, this is required by the library. So here let's just assign our SQL settings. And let's override a method here, which is called onConfiguring. So there will be this method onConfiguring like this. And this one actually accepts DB context options builder. All right, and here within this override, we just want to set that options builder and want to use SQL Server. And here we have a requirement to provide our connection string. So we just make use of our SQL settings and our connection string property. And one more thing that we want to override here is a method called onModelCreating. So protected override void on model creating. And this one actually accepts a thing called model builder like this. And here we can make use of the Fluent API of our entity framework to actually set up a mappings or relations between our models. Of course, we could get back to our, for example, bucket or an item and just use, for example, properties here like table and just provide our table name and other required using. But we want to actually follow this domain-driven design, I would say, and we want to keep our models really clean. We don't want them to interfere with any database-specific logic. Therefore, we would like to use a Fluent mapper instead within our particular database library. So here, let's just say we have a bucket builder, and this one will be of type model builder.entity of a bucket, like this. Add a using here to our domain, and we can explicitly specify that our bucket builder has key and just assign it to our ID being of type GUID. And we can do the same for our item. So we'll just create an item builder here of type item, like this. All right, we are almost good to go. Now, let's actually open our app settings and let's create this new section called SQL here. All right. And within our SQL, we just want to have this connection string property. And we just need to assign our connection string properly. So in that case, that will be like this. Server will be equal to actually localhost. Then you have the user ID. So it will be this SA, which stands for the system account, our password. So in that case, it will be ABCD1234 exclamation mark. And finally, the database that we want to use. So in that case, it will be our Cubo. And this is how our connection string may look like. And this connection string will be, of course, passed to our Cubo context via our custom SQL settings class. Now let's open our startup. And within our startup, let's execute the following code for our IOC container. So here we can say services configure and just configure our SQL settings like this. Add the using here. And we want to do it using our configuration get section SQL. And one more thing that we want to do is to actually say services at, and here we just want to make use of the entity framework SQL Server, like this. And we also want to here specify that we want to use at db context, like this, and provide our Cubo context. Okay, and this one actually comes from the extensions, so we'll just need to install our entity framework call to the API as well. And basically, this is a setup that we want to use in order to start with working with our entity framework. And in the next video, you will see how we can actually make use of this Cubo context and create our custom repository. In this video, you saw how we can create a new SQL Server database and how we can configure our entity framework core library